So welcome everybody as always. The question came up last week about transit times. Unfortunately, I don't see the gentleman that asked the question here today. So anyway, he did ask the question, and since this is my policy to answer questions, I will do so. So the question was regarding the Gulf Stream, how long it took for ships to sail from one place to another via whether they were sail or powered. So I tried to use ships that I had already spoken about. And so if we look at a sail ship, right, and you're sailing from Europe to North America, the average transit time going that way was 6 weeks. Now, if the wind wasn't good, that transit time could be 14 weeks, and frequently ships carrying a lot of immigrants actually began to run out of food. So that's not a good thing. Well, I talked about the Sirius, which was the first paddle wheel steamer to cross the Atlantic totally on steam power. The Sirius managed to do it in 18 days, so that's significantly faster. The SS Great Britain, which I said was the first screw propeller ship to cross the Atlantic, that did it in 14 days. So we could see that as things got better, the propulsion things got much quicker. Now coming back the other way with the Gulf Stream, a sailing ship can probably make it probably about 8 knots, and they can probably make it in, I believe, 16 days. So you can see that the Gulf Stream has a significant effect on this transit times. But really, in this era, I think the more important thing is not so much speed. And of course, speed in naval warfare is very important, don't get me wrong. But the most important single thing, I think, is the fact that you are able to maneuver that ship anywhere you want to. So if you need to get behind somebody, you don't have to worry about which way the wind's blowing. You just basically point the ship in the direction that it's going, and that's how you're going to get there. So hopefully that answers that question. Anyway, today we are talking about naval warfare after the first Industrial Revolution, and we will see numerous changes from the age of sail, or as I prefer it, wooden ships and iron men. Yes, sir.
Could you remind us of the time frame of the first Industrial Revolution?
Yes. The question is when was the first Industrial Revolution? It's from approximately 1760 to 70. It depends on who you want to read. And it goes on until the 1840s. So that would be what the time frame from the first Industrial Revolution. The second Industrial Revolution starts a little more specific. Most people say it starts in 1867 and goes till 1914. Okay. Well, anyway, first Industrial Revolution, naval warfare, and you can see there's some big changes from those Napoleonic pictures. Well, the first big change really is in guns. As I spoke about before, when you have an explosive shell, explosive shells have numerous problems early on. For example, they cannot take a lot of muzzle blasts, so you cannot propel them very quickly or use a large amount of powder to blow them out of a barrel. So, what is normally used to fire the shells like this is a mortar. And you also put these in mortars shoot at a high angle, right? And they are relatively low velocity guns. And the other problem with them is the fuses that they use are very, very difficult to control. So there's a lot of issues with these things blowing up early. So you put them on unimportant ships that you don't have to worry about damaging a valuable ship with these types of weapons. Well, the other piece with mortars is they are hard to hit anything throwing stuff up in a big arc. What you want to do is you want to be able to fire guns, particularly with these types of primitive range finding, on a flat arc like you would shoot a rifle. Well, in order to do that, again, you need a large amount of powder, and these shells can't take it. So General Picson, Henri Picson, in 1822 and 1823 develops this new type of gun. So it is specifically designed to fire shells. And of course, shells now, because when they hit a ship and explode, that is a big problem for wooden ships because wooden ships are likely to catch fire when that happens. So, and that is the death knell of wooden ships. So Pixon comes up with this shell gun. What he also comes up with, though, is this type of shell. And please note that the shell has what's known as a sabot on it. The sabot is a shoe of wood that goes around a smaller diameter explosive shell. It looks like a cannonball, but it's actually a shell. And what happens with that is that when you fire this thing, because of the shoe, the sabot, it makes the windage, in other words, the gap between the barrel and the gun, tighter. And what that allows you to do is to use less powder and still get the same kind of range out of this weapon. The other thing that his shell does is it has a much more reliable fuse, and the fuse is ignited from the actual blast of the cannon. You don't have to light the fuse and drop it down the barrel. When you fire this thing, because the fuse is actually into the sabot, when you fire it, that will ignite the fuse. So what happens with these is when you shoot it, you hit the target, it's already lit going in, it sticks into the wooden ship, and then when the fuse burns down, it explodes. They are first used by the Russian fleet as a significant amount of these Pixon shell guns in 1853 at the Battle of Sinop, and they completely destroy a Turkish fleet. So at that point, it's obvious that there's a big problem now with wooden ships. Wooden ships are going to be so really the bringing of armor to ships is really more of a factor, and iron into ships is more of a factor of fire than it really is about resistance to cannonballs and bouncing off. Well, the French in 1855 decide they're going to build a bunch of these ironclad gunboats. And you can see this one here is the Love. And what they're going to do with these is they're going to make 10 of them. But they can't make 10 of them. They don't have the capability. So they hire the British to make an additional 5. So, and remember, in the Crimean War, the French and the British fought together against the Russians. They are flat-bottom boats. They are not seaworthy. They do have a screw propeller, but they are actually really a barge. And they are towed to the Crimean to fight there. And they do fight at the First Battle of Kinburn. And indeed, they proved to be highly effective. They have 4 inches of wrought iron armor, and that's enough to defeat the cannon of the Russians at Kinburn. And so they get in close, and they fire for 3 hours, and they defeat the Russian forts. So indeed, that's the first use of ironclad vessels in warfare is at Kinburn. And it really now, between the shell gun and the proof of these things, it's obvious that ships now need to be made out of metal. Well, the French and the British begin to have an arms race, and a naval arms race. And they are trying to come up with ships that are going to revolutionize things. And the French, in 1859, create the first ocean-going ironclad called the Gloire. The Gloire is about 5,000 tons. It is a wooden-hulled ship, but it has armor plate, and it is definitely the world's best ship when it's built. But in 1861, the British decide they're going to up the ante, and they come up with the Warrior-class ships. The Warrior-class ships are iron-hulled. They are at 9,000 tons. They carry a very large armament. They're capable of over 14 knots speed, and they are indeed the world's most powerful ships when they are made. And if you would like to see the Warrior, you can go to Portsmouth, England, and it is available to be toured this day. It is an amazing ship for 1861. Well, that brings us to the American Civil War, and the plan was, by Winfield Scott, was this thing called the Anaconda Plan. So the Anaconda Plan was designed to defeat the Confederacy. And what he was going to do is he was going to blockade all the Confederate ports, and also he was going to send a large force, approximately 80,000 men, down the Mississippi River and all the way to New Orleans to capture the entire Mississippi. By doing that, he would cut the Confederacy into two. What they would do is they would have a small group with gunboats and be very mobile going down the river, and then a large army would follow behind. So it's really a pretty interesting plan. And really, if you look at this, because of the nature of the way they're going to do this, it's actually a good example of total war. What they're going to do is they're going to choke, hence the Anaconda, the Confederates from getting supplies from the outside world, and they're going to destroy their infrastructure and ability to transport those supplies by cutting the Mississippi River. Well, how does this go? Well, first we've got to talk about Winfield Scott. At this point, Winfield Scott is extremely old, and as you can see by this picture, extremely out of shape. But Winfield Scott, pretty good plan, really, but the fact of the matter is his plan is ridiculed. It's like, dude, what are you doing? This war is going to be over in no time. We don't have time to be bothering with all this stuff. And indeed, what they do is they send McDowell's army, like I talked about previously, even though it's completely unprepared, to crush the Confederacy. Of course, indeed, at the First Battle of Bull Run, that army is routed by the Confederates. And the war is now realized it's going to go on much longer than they anticipated. Well, the other pieces with the plan, why it's ridiculed, is first of all, the Union Navy doesn't have anything near enough ships to blockade all these ports. And there is absolutely no fleet or capability to sail down the Mississippi River and capture all these things. Well, Lincoln has already proclaimed the blockade 1 week after Fort Sumter. And what happens is, as more southern states secede, they don't all secede at one time. I think everybody's probably aware of that. But they secede in general steps. And as more and more southern states secede from the Union, the coastline of the United States gets, or the Confederate States gets bigger and bigger, and more ports need to be blockaded. So it's really puts this plan in a tough situation. And actually, the blockade is not rescinded until the end of the war by Lincoln. Well, the naval battles of the Civil War will be dominated by three things. First of all, they'll be dominated by the blockade of the Confederate ports and the Confederates' effort to defeat that blockade. They will also be based on trying to control the Mississippi River. And lastly, the Confederates will make an effort using privateers and commerce raiders to disrupt the Union's ability to transport goods and services to the United States. So we'll see all three of those things are really prevalent in this naval war in the Civil War. Well, so historically, and I mean as early as when I would read about this when I was, younger and worked a lot on the American Civil War, historically people would think that the Anaconda Plan was really foolish, that it wasn't really a good plan. But Scott's, really his plan looked at the fact that the war was going to go on for a long time, that it would be a 4-year war. And indeed, his plan is actually quite a good plan, as it turns out. So what happens is the Confederacy is indeed split in two, that he does establish numerous ports are blockaded, and it's really today the Anaconda Plan has been pretty much has become respectable, or has been seen as actually quite a good plan. And the fact of the matter is that historians had always focused on Lee and Grant in Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac being the critical factors within this battle. But the fact that the Anaconda Plan cut the resources that the South had to use, and it cut the South in two pieces, is now been seen as that the Anaconda Plan really was a critical factor in the loss of the war by the South. So it has been, seen to be a good idea, and it now really is looked at as that this was a guiding point for Lincoln's overall strategy for the war. So you can see that the Anaconda Plan really has been seen now as a much more important piece of the war. So again, naval warfare now is viewed as much more important. Well, how's this going to go? When the war broke out, April 12th of 1861, the Confederacy really has no ships. They really have no Navy. Most of the U.S. Navy does not join the Confederacy. Some does, but not a lot of it. And they need to get ships from somebody. So they begin to contract ships from the French and primarily the British. And the British will be their main supplier because the British desperately want their export of cotton. In order to keep their mills going, they want that cotton. And so that will be their main supplier of military equipment. The plan originally is going to be from a gentleman called Captain Raphael Semmes. Some of you may be familiar with Mr. Semmes. He does have a large statue in Mobile. And if you want to see that, it's right downtown. And so what he wants to do is he wants to have a militia of privateers. In other words, civilian vessels that will act under letters of marque from the Confederate government to function as basically raiders and also blockade runners. So Jefferson Davis, just a few days after the start of the war, actually issues letters of marque per the recommendation of Raphael Semmes, and indeed this is what happens. Well, what is a letter of marque? A letter of marque, or a letter of marque and reprisal is actually the more proper term, is a government authorization for private citizens to function as a part of the military, as in effect military auxiliaries. This is used primarily for ships. So if I have a ship and I'm going to run the blockade, if I have a letter of marque, that's a good thing. If I have a ship and I'm going to use it to capture Union ships as an auxiliary cruiser, then indeed I need to have a letter of marque, because if I have a letter of marque and I'm captured, I have to be treated as a prisoner of war. If I don't have a letter of marque and I am captured, I am a pirate, and therefore I am an enemy of the world and should be hung. So there's a big difference with letters of marque and being respectable, and a letter of marque and being someone that is indeed just a pirate. Well, Article 1 of the United States Constitution indeed gives the United States Congress the authority to issue letter of marque and reprisal, along with things like declaring war and collecting taxes. So letters of marque are respected by the United States Constitution. In 1856, the French have a conference in Paris, and it's decided that perhaps letters of marque should not be respected, and it's become U.S. policy since that time not to issue letters of marque, but it's still in the Constitution. With that said, Lincoln decides that he is not going to respect the Jefferson Davis's letters of marque, and he's going to treat captured Confederate privateers and blockade runners as pirates. Jeff Davis decides to issue some threats, and the British government strongly opposes this, and indeed Lincoln is forced to back down. So they do respect letters of marque by the Confederacy. Well, war breaks out. the Confederates have very, very little supplies to really be in the middle of a war. For example, they only have in the entire Confederacy 500,000 percussion caps. And remember, percussion caps are what you use to fire a percussion rifle, a cap lock, or you use percussion caps to fire your cannon. They've only got 500,000 in the entire Confederacy, and they have absolutely no capacity to make them. They have no factories to make percussion caps. If you think about it, and there's a battle and you got 50,000 guys and they fire 10 rounds each, then basically you've got enough caps in the entire Confederacy to have one day of battle. So they desperately need to get some product here. Well, what they do is they get the British, they buy the Finnegal, and the Finnegal is loaded up with supplies that they need. And then they sail it to the Confederacy, and the Confederacy then adopts it as a Confederate ship as the CSS Atlanta. But what's it carrying? That one ship is carrying 10,000 Enfield rifles, 1 million cartridges for those rifles, 2 million percussion caps, 400 barrels of gunpowder, and other military goods, which were primarily swords. And then, of course, now they also have the ship, which they can use for Confederate purposes. So, as the war continues, more and more private companies begin to build blockade runners. And you can see this picture here. The blockade runners are not really like a regular merchant ship. They are built low, they are built sleek, they have large engines, they're designed to be fast and be able to break through or avoid the blockade. So early on, 80% of these ships get through. As the war continues, then the Union blockade becomes much more effective. I believe 1,455 are actually captured or destroyed by the Union Navy. So as things go on, things get worse. Yes, Jim?
Were these ships armed?
Generally, no. They certainly could be if they had the proper letter of marque. The question is, were these ships armed? And generally not, because they want them just to be fast. So that they didn't need any extra weight. They needed to carry cargo, the blockade runners. We'll get to raiders, though. So, if we look at the Confederacy, you can see I have circled the major ports that were used for blockade runners. Notice that Norfolk is not being used because it's much too close to the Union, and it's really easy to blockade it. In fact, the Union built a couple of forts right outside the harbor. But a lot of this area is like Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah. Jacksonville, I don't think, had a lot of rail lines, so I think that's why that wasn't used. I'm not sure. Of course, Mobile, New Orleans, and Galveston. So, again, you needed a port that had rail connections, and these were primarily agricultural ports, so they indeed had agricultural product to come to the port to be shipped out, so they had more railroads. So they want to blockade these things, the Union does, and it's much like Napoleon's strategy to defeat the British Navy from the land, which we talked about last week. It's the same idea. If they can close these ports, then indeed they can shut the ability for the Confederacy to get supplies. So the other piece is, if you capture the Mississippi River, Galveston now becomes basically, you can only supply things west of the Mississippi, so Galveston becomes much less important. So the other piece is, too, is as these ports are captured by the Union, and some of them, of course, are, they can then take the ships that were blockading those ports and move them to other locations where they'd be more useful. So it makes, as you shrink the pie down, it's easier and easier to defend. And later in the war, they actually begin to station squadrons of ships at the Florida Keys in order to prevent any access to the Gulf of Mexico. So they really become very proactive with this. I'm not today going to talk about any of the capture of these ports. Alan Hines will be giving a very nice lecture as part of the 200th anniversary of Alabama about the capture of Mobile Bay, so I would highly recommend that you catch Alan's presentation of that, and he will go into great detail about how Mobile Bay was captured. Well, everybody here has probably seen Gone with the Wind. If you haven't, I'm sure many of you have seen it. And you may remember that the rich Southerners are having a big party, and basically the guest of honor is a guy named Rhett Butler. Well, Rhett Butler is a blockade runner. And you might go, well, he's a great guy, he's a hero, he's bringing in weapons and all this stuff. Well, blockade runners had other things that they would bring in too, that were particularly appealing to very wealthy Southern people, and that were incredible luxury goods. So luxury goods that they could no longer get from Europe would be brought in by these blockade runners as well, and that would certainly enhance their profits. Well, so that you see why Rhett Butler is so incredibly popular is because he's bringing in stuff that these people really can't get their hands on. I would assume things like perfume would be something that he would be able to ship. Probably not caviar. But anyway, by 1864, the Confederate government has had enough of this. They're like, okay, look, this has to stop. And they ban anything except arms and paper, because the South has a problem making paper. They really don't have the capacity or the capability to make a lot of paper products. So writing paper is very valuable to them, and that can be shipped in on blockade runners as well. My assumption, though, even at this time, that deep in that hole there was probably a few things that they shouldn't have been bringing in. But, you know, people will make a profit. All right, if we look at this map real quickly, you can see Portsmouth and the Gosport Navy Yard down on the bottom. You can see the entrance of Hampton Road leads to Chesapeake Bay. That is where the ocean is, so that's going out to the ocean. You can see this circle, which will become important later on. We can see the Merrimack, the Virginia, the Cumberland, the Congress, the Minnesota. All these will be critical to the very famous battle of the Monitor and the CSS Virginia. So, but let's first start about Gosport, because Gosport actually is very critical to this. So actually, Virginia is yet to secede, but there are a lot of secessionists that are beginning to close in on Portsmouth. And the Union naval commander of the Portsmouth Navy Yard is very, very concerned. And he actually gets orders from Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, to get the ships out of there and start to clean out the Navy Yard before it becomes captured. Well, he's got a lot of subordinates that are Confederate sympathizers and the secessionists, and they begin to delay his efforts. So this drags on all the way till April 20th, and at that point he realizes that he can't get these ships out of there. And so they decide to burn 9 ships, one of them being the USS Merrimack, and they don't do a particularly good job of destroying the Portsmouth Navy Yard. For example, the graving dock, you might refer to it as a dry dock, is not thoroughly destroyed. They leave behind 1,000 very heavy naval cannon. So these naval cannon now will be a huge supply for the Confederacy. They now have 1,000 guns that they wouldn't have had, and these are big, heavy naval guns. They're not little 12-pounder Napoleons. So these guns will actually be used throughout the South to defend ports and to be put onto ships. So it's a big advantage there. They also get a bunch of gunpowder and ammunition. So the failure to destroy properly the Gosport Navy Yard is a big, big loss for the Union. Well, the Union, like I said earlier a little bit, was that they have got Hampton Roads heavily blockaded and actually 2 forts. So the Confederates cannot get out of here. This port is totally cut off from the outside world. Well, the South, like I said, doesn't have a lot of ships. They're very, very tight for ships. They don't have that capability, but what they're going to do is they're going to embrace technology to overcome that problem. And of course, the technology they're going to embrace is going to be the ironclad. And it's really kind of similar to what the British do with the HMS Dreadnought right before World War I. In other words, these types of ships make all other ships obsolete. So basically, these ships, you're making other ships worthless, and therefore you can start at page 1 versus your adversaries. Well, it's a great plan, but the South has a problem in that they cannot create steam engines. They don't have the capability to make the proper engines. They don't have the infrastructure built for these kinds of things. We talked about that with railroads. They have a very, very difficult time making train engines. Most of their train engines are either old, leftover, captured, or imported. Same issue goes with this. They really can't make good steam engines. So they look at this Merrimack, and they look at it and they go, hey, you know, well, what if we raise that up? And it's not too bad. Maybe we can fix that baby up. So they raised the Merrimack, and they put it in that graving dock, which wasn't properly destroyed, and they begin to build a new ship that will be an ironclad known as the CSS Virginia. Well, the CSS Virginia is a very interesting design, I think. First of all, you may not realize it, but the bow, the rear, and the front, and the stern, the rear, are actually meant to be semi-submerged, again, to make them less of a target. Then on top of the main deck is a big iron citadel is placed on top. Well, the problem is the Merrimack, the engines were due to be replaced. They have now been underwater for a significant time, so they're not in particularly good condition. But they do the best they can to make this ship out of the old Merrimack. And they were going to put armor plate on it, and originally they were going to just put 1-inch thick armor plate, and then people were like, that's probably not a good idea. And they decided to put 2-inch plates backed with a heavy amount of wood. So it's a pretty well armored ship. She has 10 guns. 8 of them are very heavy Dahlgren cannons that they have recovered, of course, from Gosport. They have 2 Brooks rifles, one in the front, one in the back. And the Brooks rifles are on a pivot, so they can be moved to a different position. The side-mounted guns are fixed. So they also put one more thing on it, going back to warfare in the Mediterranean, and that is a iron ram. So we can see now that this ship has a pretty good power and it has an iron ram. So it's got a lot of going for it. But putting all that armor on it, submerging basically the hull, which makes it much more resistant to water, has caused major issues. First, the ship draws. Draws means its depth in the water is 21 feet. That's very, very deep, especially in the shallow water around Hampton Roads. It is incredibly slow because it weighs so much and the engines aren't good. It can only go about 5 or 6 knots. The other problem is they didn't design the steering very well, and in order for this ship to make a 360-degree circle, it takes 1 mile and it takes it 45 minutes. So this is not a very maneuverable vessel. Well, the Union has gotten word of this through spies, that there's an ironclad being built by the Confederates, and they're very, very concerned about that. And they are going to build this thing, the USS Monitor, and they managed to build this thing in 101 days. It's incredibly fast. Now, one thing to note for our further part of our lecture, this is where the captain controls the ship from. So keep that in mind. The Monitor is the precursor really to the modern battleship. It has no sails. It is 100% steam powered. It has a screw propeller. It has a turret. That turret was created by Theodore Timby. So you can see that the 2 main guns are actually in this turret. It was created, the rest of the ship, by Ericsson, and Ericsson is a Swedish inventor, He, as you may remember from last week's class, is the creator of the first U.S. screw steamer, wooden steamer. And he has got radical ideas about how ships should be built. Again, he thinks that ships should be as low to the water as possible to make as little target as possible. And he builds the Monitor, and when people see this Monitor, they're looking at this thing going, what the heck is that thing? That's a weird looking strip. And so critics refer to the Monitor as a cheese box on a raft because it's just a weird looking thing for them. Well, Ericsson's a very patriotic guy, and he donates 40 patents to the United States government. He could have made himself incredibly rich, but does not. Interesting, Timby, who created that turret, is not that patriotic and actually got a big paycheck. So, but anyway, it was launched on January 30th of 1862 and was in battle by March 8th. So there was very, very little time for this ship to work up. Basically, they weren't quite sure how everything was going. Well, let's talk real quick about that turret. Yes? I can't hear you.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about, the turret.
Oh, we're getting there. Okay. All right, so the turret. Because of it's a single turret, it is what's referred to as an all-big gun ship, which we will talk about again when we get to the Dreadnought. The turret can spin 360 degrees in 22 seconds, and it can technically fire in all directions, but you do not want to fire directly astern, because if you do, you will shoot off your smokestack. And you do not want to shoot directly ahead, because indeed that's where your pilot house is, and you really don't want to shoot the pilot house. So, but it can maneuver quite a lot. But it's very difficult to control. The turret spins, but they don't have very precise control of how it spins. So if you overshoot a little bit, you only have two options. You can reverse the steam engines, which is virtually impossible in the middle of a battle, or you can go all the way around again and try to get it where you want it to be. The other piece with it is there's no visibility. You don't have any periscopes, you don't have any range finders, you don't have any of those things you would find on a modern turret. You have to open these steel shutters and look out to see what you're going to shoot at. So, and so if you're reloading the guns, you bring them in, you close the steel shutters, well now you can't see anything. So until you reopen them, so the opposing ship is going, you're not sure where it's going. So you've got to, and it takes a long time to load these guns. They don't load quickly at all. It takes minutes to load them. So it's really a very cumbersome thing to do. And it's, again, they haven't trained on it. They've only been to sea for, 40 days or so. So the turret itself is an odd design as well. This turret, it's mounted on a 9-inch iron spindle. And the way this turret works is the spindle lifts the whole turret up. The turret then spins, and then it drops it back down onto a brass ring, and the brass ring is designed to help prevent it from getting a lot of water in, which it doesn't work particularly well. The other piece, though, when you have this turret lifted on this spindle, so you've actually lifted this whole thing up, and now there's a gap. If debris gets into that gap, or if a large shell should hit that turret while it's up on this 9-inch spindle, it's going to bend that spindle. So you have a design here that's really no one else uses. The British Coles turret is actually a much better design. But again, this is the first one to be used in battle. And again, Timby did make a profit on this puppy. So again, it's an odd design by what we think of a modern turret being on a gearbox, really. That's if you looked at the Alabama under construction, for example, you could see that it's actually geared. But this thing would lift the whole thing up, turn, and then drop it down. So, with that said, let us take a short break, and then we will get to the battle between the Virginia and the Monitor. All right, good. Ready or not? I got a lot of ways to go yet. All right, so on March 8th, 1862, the CSS Virginia sails out to break the the Union blockade. And they run into the sloop of war Cumberland, the frigate Congress. There's also the St. Lawrence, and the steam frigates Roanoke, Minnesota. And those are near where I talked about Fort Monroe, those fortresses that are blocking the entrance to Hampton Roads. So all those Union ships are out there, and they see this thing coming. And they know what it is. This is not a surprise. And they're like, uh-oh, we got to get out of Dodge here, because this is going to be a problem. And so the Union ships begin to try to leave Hampton Roads. Well, as I said, Hampton Roads is pretty shallow, and many of them begin to run aground. For example, the St. Lawrence, Roanoke, and Minnesota all run aground immediately. The Cumberland and the Congress were anchored in deeper water, and they are also trying to raise anchor and get out of Dodge too, but they see this thing coming, and they begin to fire at it. And of course, their ammunition is bouncing off the 4-inch of iron plate on the Virginia. And the Virginia, even though it's so incredibly slow because Congress was anchored and is not able to get up steam and get away, it actually uses its ram to crash into the side of the Cumberland. The Cumberland immediately begins to sink. And while the Cumberland is sinking, the ram is stuck into the side of the Cumberland. Well, guess what? Now the Virginia is beginning to sink because she can't back the ram out. Well, fortunately for them, the ram breaks off, and the Virginia is freed, and the Cumberland sinks. Well, in the meantime, the Congress has tried to get up steam, and the Congress runs aground. So now the Virginia sails over by the Congress, and the Congress surrenders. But strangely, no one knows for sure if the shell fire from the Virginia set it on fire or if the Union set that ship on fire. There's debate on both sides in this regard. But she is also destroyed. So 2 of these ships are destroyed immediately by the Virginia. Well, Virginia is a pig, and it's 21 feet draught in the water, so it's really deep. The tide is going out, and the Virginia goes, well, I guess we're out of luck for the rest of the day. We'll go sail back home. Also, their commander, Admiral Buchanan, has been wounded in this battle, and so they decide that they're going to come back the next day and finish off these ships that are all run aground. Well, the next day dawns, and the Virginia goes sailing out, and the Minnesota is still stuck. So they're going to go out and destroy the Minnesota. And they see what they think to be a barge. They see this barge, and they get closer to the barge, and they find out it's not a barge. It's the USS Monitor that's rushed down there to defend these ships and to fight the Virginia. Well, this begins now an incredibly long and inconclusive fight. I'll put it that way. So, part of the reason that this fight is inconclusive is because of the weaponry on both of the ships. The Virginia, thinking that it was going to attack wooden ships, has only brought shells. They haven't brought any solid, perhaps armor-piercing cannon rounds. They've only brought shells. Well, the shells, as you can see from this picture, are not particularly effective against the armor of the Monitor. They just basically are denting it. So they don't have anything that will penetrate armor like solid shot. The Monitor's problem is different. Because of the design of the turret, it is felt that the turret cannot take a significant amount of blast from recoil from its giant 11-inch Dahlgren guns. And what the Dahlgren gun is capable of is having 30 pounds of powder to fire one round. They limit the amount of powder for that weapon to 15 pounds, so they cut it in half. So now the muzzle velocity of those weapons is much, much lower. And so needless to say, their solid shot doesn't have enough force to punch through the armor of the Virginia. So neither ship really can do much to the other one. the Virginia tries to ram the Monitor, but the Virginia is so incredibly slow and unwieldy, the Monitor is vastly more nimble and just avoids it. So they go around in circles for a long time firing at each other, pretty much at point blank range. And neither side is really having much effect until the Virginia fires into the little pilot house, which I showed you in that first picture, and that shell blinds the commander of the Monitor. He is now, the Monitor actually at this point loses control because he's not controlling the ship. They get him out of there and they decide to withdraw a little bit and regroup. When that happens, the Merrimack, or excuse me, the Virginia thinks that indeed they have won the battle, but once again the tide is going out and they can't reach the Minnesota to destroy it. At this point, both ships withdraw. Well, what happens next is the Union begins to make an overland assault onto the Gosport Navy Yard. The Virginia is drawing again so much water it can't sail up the James River, and they decide to disarm the Virginia and destroy it and burn it. The Monitor is being transferred to another port further south. It is out in the Atlantic. Remember, this is not a very seaworthy vessel. And remember, I said that turret ring has a tendency to leak water. It gets into a big storm, and indeed the Monitor is sunk. So neither of these ships ever fights again.
Was the armor on both of those ships the same thickness?
Relatively the same.
Say 4 inches?
It's two 2-inch plates on the Virginia, 2 separate 2-inch plates. The armor on the Monitor, as I remember, was I think a solid plate of 4.5 inches. But
So
both
those
were.
dents were made into 4.5 inch.
Uh-huh. Well, you're firing a cannon
That's a lot
at
of force.
point blank range. It's a cannon. So, boom. All right. But anyway, so now let's talk about what's going on in the Mississippi River. Well, James Eads, he's a really wealthy industrialist in St. Louis area. And he says to the Union, you know, I really like the Union cause. I'm going to do what I can to help it. And I've got this ship that I'm willing to give you, and we can turn this ship into an ironclad, and we can go help defeat the South. Well, the Union sends Commander John Rogers down there, and he takes a look at the ship that Eads wants to give him and says, this isn't going to work. This ship is not a good idea to turn into an ironclad. Well, so originally they're not really getting along, but actually later on they begin to collaborate quite effectively. And the reason is that Eads, he knows construction, and he knows the river, and Rogers knows warships. So they decide that they're going to create warships together. Well, what they want to do is they want to get gunboats that have armor adequate to withstand direct shots, sufficient speed to go against the current. Remember, the Mississippi River has a significant current in places. It's got to be a shallow draft because it's a river boat, and it has to have enough armament to be credible. Well, they bring in Samuel Pooke, who is a ship designer from the United States Navy, and Pooke is the one who actually designs the ships, and even though Rogers and Eads are the construction guys, the real design is Pooke's, and they're referred to as Pooke's turtles. Well, what is a Pooke turtle? Here's the USS Louisville. It is a vessel that only has 6 feet of water draft, so it's only 6 feet of water, so it's perfect for a river. It has 13 guns. It can go 8 knots. These are, in effect, paddle wheel steamers. So when we think of a Mississippi riverboat, you know, with a big wheel in the back to push it along the river, that's exactly what these were. Only they're armored, and they would even armor around the wheel, but not the back of the wheel. So they're really, you know, a Mississippi riverboat that's just been turned into a warship. So they're originally built in St. Louis. St. Louis has dry dock facilities. It has a trained workforce. It's the perfect place to be building ships like this because mainly it's on the Mississippi River. So they're already where they need to be to start the battles. They don't need to transport them in. They're built in place. And these are actually the first armored warships of the U.S. Now, I said the U.S. I didn't say the U.S. Navy because for the first year, these are not ships of the Navy. These are ships of the United States Army. And they're not transferred to the Navy until October of 1862. So they're actually Army ships. Well, the first use of these is to attack Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. It's a plant by Ulysses S. Grant, who is not commander of the entire Union Army at this time. He's just a general out in the West, which they would refer to this as the West. And he decides that what he's going to do is he's going to take Fort Henry and he's going to land his troops north of Fort Henry. The gunboats are going to get in there first, begin to bombard Fort Henry, then his army will move short distance overland and capture the fort. Well, it's raining a lot. And this fort has been put in a particularly terrible place. It's raining so much that the fort is beginning to go underwater. Not a good design. The powder magazine, for example, before the Union ships even arrive, is flooded, so their powder is flooded. They only have 9 guns available that are above water, and the Confederate commander knows that it's pointless to try to hold this fort for any significant amount of time, and tells the vast majority of his troops to evacuate, go to, I believe, Fort Donelson at the time, and then he is going to put up a token resistance against the U.S. Ships to give them time to escape. Well, on February 6th, Foote shows up. He begins to bombard the fort, what little there is, and he offers the fort to surrender, and the fort says, no, we're not going to surrender, and they begin the bombardment, and it goes on for a very short time, and eventually the Confederates are going to get into a tough spot and they're going to surrender. Well, I told you these ships had 2.5 inches of armor. They're not particularly heavily armored. And one of the 32-pound balls from the Confederate guns actually penetrates into the Essex. It hits the boiler of the Essex, which is a terrible place for it to hit, because what then happens is they're all scalded on that deck by steam. So they have 32 casualties, a significant amount of them are burned to death. So it's one shot out of all these cannonballs actually does penetrate one of these ships. So they're not a particularly great design, but again, they're river boats. They're not really ocean going. It's not like certainly the Warrior class British ships. Well, the other interesting thing about this battle, had the Union waited a couple of days, the fort would have been totally underwater and there was absolutely no need to attack it whatsoever. So the first, it's one of those things, you know, it's hard to know that, but the fact of the matter is the fort was so poorly sited and so poorly designed that it actually was underwater. Well, the fight down the Mississippi River continues to go rather well, and New Orleans, for example, is not captured from north to south, but is actually a seaborne invasion, and New Orleans has already fallen. And the Grant and the Poop Turtles are moving down the Mississippi River. And the last piece of Confederate territory to keep the Mississippi open is at Vicksburg. Vicksburg has very high bluffs. And what has gone on is Grant has actually moved his army overland south of Vicksburg, but now needs the ships and the supplies that they contain to get south of Vicksburg. The commander of these ships at this time is Admiral Foote. Porter. Foote's in New Orleans. Anyway, what he comes up with is that he notices that the shells are only hitting the tops of his ships. So the Confederate guns are so high up on this bluff that they can't depress their muzzles low enough. And what he says is we're going to run by them at night. We're going to keep the cargo ships that Grant needs on the inside away from the guns, so these ships will protect them from shell fire. And we're going to sail as close to the bluffs as we possibly can to limit damage. And they sail by, and they only lose one ship in this entire thing. So it's a very, very successful thing. And Grant is now resupplied, and he now can use these ships to bombard and help him cross the river to capture Vicksburg. And indeed, he does do that, and he captures Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863. The day before, of course, July 3rd, 1863, is the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, which is a huge, huge loss for the Confederates. So in 2 days, the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia is defeated at Gettysburg, and the last opening on the Mississippi River is closed at Vicksburg. So the South is in major, major trouble now because now it's been cut in two according to the original Anaconda Plan. Well, the other major thing that goes on at this time is the development of what at the time is referred to as a torpedo, or what we would today refer to as a mine. You can see here a picture of what these were. Frequently, they could be iron as well, but frequently they were a barrel that was waterproofed, stuffed with gunpowder, and then anchored to the bottom of a river or the ocean. And there's two ways to fire these. One way is to have a contact fuse on them, so if a ship hits it, it hits the contact fuse, it blows up and damages or sinks the ship. The second method is to use an electric wire, and you would see when the ship was coming over where you believed the mine to be, and they would usually use little markers so they had an idea of where it was. And when the ship got in the right position, you would close the circuit, trigger the mine, and the mine would blow up. Now, at this era, mines are not particularly reliable. They tend to leak. The electric systems tend to be very fragile and don't frequently work. But occasionally they do, and we see as time goes on in this war, the mine becomes more and more important. The reason they were called torpedoes at this time is believed that Robert Fulton, the creator of the Clermont, the first commercial success steamship, referred to them as torpedo fish. And the torpedo fish has a large electric charge, kind of like an electric eel. So they think that's where the name torpedo actually came from for these mines. And they, again, became more and more used for high-value waterways and ocean ports. Well, on December 12th, 1862, the mine creates its first victim. That is the Cairo. We would look at it as Cairo, but in Illinois, we don't pronounce it that way. We pronounce that word Cairo. And the Cairo is destroyed by a, in quotes, torpedo, or as we would know it, a mine, and becomes the first ship in history to be sunk by a mine. Well, the way that one worked is there were Confederates hiding by the riverbank. They could see when the Cairo got into place. They threw an electric circuit and indeed detonated, and she is the first ship sunk. She has also been raised, and there is a Cairo museum that you can see this ship as well.
Is Cairo in Georgia too?
Well, hot damn.
I just wanted to say something about the Battle of Vicksburg. If you go to Point Clear to the Grand Hotel,
Yes?
there's a Confederate cemetery there. There are Confederates, it's not a totally Confederate cemetery, but there's a Confederate area of the cemetery that's right across the street from the hotel.
Yep.
By the golf course, and some of those casualties were brought from the Battle of Vicksburg.
I wasn't sure where those casualties had come from, but I am familiar with the cemetery then.
And I'm just saying, how did they ever survive to get that far away from Vicksburg?
Well, they would transport bodies at that time. It was not uncommon to have embalmers follow battle armies around and bomb people right after a battle and then ship them home.
Well, the Grand Hotel was the Confederate hospital.
Yep. And it was also then in World War II was a training base for, I can't remember, naval aviators or something. Been there a couple of times. It's a nice hotel. I would recommend it. But yes, thank you. All right, so next is the submarine. So we've got mines, and now we've got submarines. Okay, so the first submarine used to attack a ship is the Turtle, created by Bushnell, and that is in the American Revolutionary War. The Turtle basically, I think it was New York Harbor where it was used. And the Turtle is really a big oak barrel, and you would fill the bottom with water, and it would submerge, and then you would, if you needed to go back up, there was a pump. You can see that actually here. And you would pump that to get the water out of it, and that would, then raise the Turtle back up. It did attack twice, they believe, and it failed both times. What it was going to use to attack with is under a significant amount of argument. You can find numerous reports that say that it was designed to put a, in quote, mine, basically like a limpet mine today, where they would screw this thing into the hull of a wooden British ship. People believe today that that is not what it was armed with, but nobody is actually sure. But the story always has been that the British ship he tried to screw this into was plated with copper, and therefore he couldn't get it to screw in. There's a lot of debate that that's really not the case.
And that's the origin of the term, now you're screwed.
Yeah, kind of that one, yes. But unfortunately, they weren't screwed, so they were okay. So that's the Turtle. Now, what's the really important thing about the Turtle, and I talked about this the other day about the propeller. Really, many people think that the Turtle and Bushnell and his co-designer, Dr. Benjamin Gale, actually are the people that created the first propeller. And there's a letter from Gale suggesting that it's a pair of oars fixed like two opposite arms of a windmill. Indeed. So it's very, very possible that the Turtle, in fact, is the first ship to deploy the propeller. So it's probably more important in that regard than the fact that it's the first ship that tried to actually attack something underwater. It does not succeed. This ship will. This is the Hunley. It's created by H.L. Hunley. He pays for it. It is a privateer. It is not part of the Confederate Navy. It is a private enterprise with a letter of marque. He uses a gentleman named James McClintock to help design this. McClintock's first submarine effort is called the Pioneer, that is created in New Orleans. When New Orleans falls to the Union from the naval attack, they abandon the Pioneer and destroy it, and they move to Mobile, Alabama, and they build two submarines there, one known as American Diver, which is only semi-successful, and the other is known as the Hunley, which, as we will know, is successful. The Hunley is designed for a crew of 8. 7 are there to turn a crank. So they're sitting, and they turn a crank to power the submarine. One person is the commander, and he's there to run that sub. It has 2 ballast tanks, one in the front, one in the rear. Again, they fill those with water. The submarine submerges. When you want to raise back up, you have hand pumps. You pump the water out, and it comes back up to the surface, sometimes. Hunley was originally designed to attack by using a towed mine. So the idea was you'd have a mine behind it on a rope. The Hunley would sneak up on the ship it was going to attack. It would dive underneath it, come back up on the other side, and the mine would come in from behind on the rope and hit the side of the ship. The contact mine would then explode and hopefully destroy the ship. That was deemed to be too risky. There's too much chance that it would fail, and they decided to switch to a spar torpedo. And we can see in this picture how the spar torpedo they believe was on the Hunley actually operated. Many people felt that the spar torpedo was to be rammed into the side of the ship and had a spike on it. That would leave the charge into the ship. They would then let the spike go, and they would back the Hunley up, and then they would pull a wire eventually, and that would explode the charge. Today, they feel that's not how this was done. They feel that they used a methodology that was used for a type of Confederate semi-submersible known as a David. The David spar torpedo was initially straight out. It would then be lowered underneath the underneath the center of the ship that you were trying to sink, and then it would be electrically fired and blow up underneath the ship you were trying to sink. Well, the Hunley, as I had kind of indicated, is very difficult to operate. It is a crew killer. The first time it sinks, 3 people manage to get out, the rest are killed. The second time it sinks, all 8 are lost, including Hunley himself. After his death, they renamed the submarine the H.L. Hunley. So it's named after him, even though they killed him. And on February 17, 1864, the Hunley launches its first attack on, it's actually been transferred to Charleston Harbor. So they moved it from Mobile to Charleston via train. And it's sent out, and it sinks the sloop of war USS Housatonic. Of course, the crew of the Hunley does not survive the attack. And so all 8 members of her third crew are again lost.
How did they get people to go down?
There were a lot of people that didn't want to, Judy. The question is, how did they get people to do this? There was a lot of people that didn't want to. They basically, the commander of Charleston Harbor actually suggested that they don't do this. But the fact of the matter is he has no control over these. These are private people. This is a private enterprise. So the Hunley is not a Confederate ship. It's a privateer. So to this day, the debate rages as to why the Hunley is lost. There is a CSS Hunley Museum. They have a website there where you can actually vote to see which are the reasons the Hunley sank. I will just give you my spin on it. The United States Navy decided to conduct, recently actually, tests with a similar amount of explosives to see if the main reason they think it happened is the explosive charge was so close to the Hunley when it went off that it knocked the crew unconscious, and then they lost control of the submarine and it was lost. The Navy does tests on this, and the Navy finds out the fact that according to their tests, that indeed the Hunley should not have been lost from that concussion, that it is not enough concussion power to have sunk the Hunley. So you can go on the website and you can vote for your favorite choice. But just think of it this way, those are your tax dollars at work. All right, that gets us to this puppy, the CSS Alabama. I told you the Confederacy is desperate for warships. They are trying to get warships built. They contract with France, they contract with Britain, and they have to use subterfuge because indeed these ships are not, they're neutrality laws. So they just can't be giving armaments to the South. And so there's a major issue about building warships. The Alabama was built in 1862 in Liverpool. And to avoid British neutrality law, you can build it 100% as a warship, but you cannot put weapons on it. So even though it's designed to carry weapons and everything about it is a warship, indeed, the Alabama is technically legal. It's very technical. It's originally known as hull number 290. It is launched as the Enrica, as a private ship. It is sailed out to sea. The U.S. Navy is aware that this is going on, and they make a desperate effort to intercept it before she can break out, but she does break out. Well, James Bullock is the gentleman who's actually creating the Alabama, and he has arranged for a civilian crew to sail her to the Azores. He then meets our good friend Raphael Semmes right here, and he shows up with 24 Confederate officers, and they also are met by another ship, the Agrippina, which is carrying their supplies and some of their armaments. All three of these ships begin to work day and night to put this thing together, and in 3 days, the three crews have completely armed the Alabama with 6 32-pound smoothbores, 2 very large pivot guns. Pivot guns are mounted on the main deck and are on a roller so they can swing from side to side. You can see Semmes is standing next to an 8-inch smoothbore. That's a really big gun. And all these guns are a British manufacture. So Enrica is then sailed into international waters and declared part of the Confederate Navy as the CSS Alabama. Well, Semmes doesn't have a crew. He's got 24 officers and him and a few sailors, but he doesn't have a crew. So he decides what he's going to do is he's going to give a rousing speech to the British crewmen that have sailed her there to convince them that they should join the Confederate cause, that indeed the Confederate cause is correct and it's the right thing to do, and he's given his fiery speech and it's fallen flat on his face. So he's looking at this crew of British guys that are all kind of staring at him going, yeah, whatever. And he comes up with a plan. He says, you know, did I fail to mention that we're going to pay you double and we're going to get a percentage of every prize we capture? And suddenly the British sailors go, huzzah, we love the Confederacy. So indeed, it's a sales pitch on Semmes' part. Well, it's commissioned, and she goes out and turns out to be one of the greatest raiders of all times. And we'll see in a quick snapshot here that she goes to the expeditionary raid, destroys 10 ships, goes to the Gulf of Mexico, sinks a U.S. ship, goes to the South Atlantic, takes 29 prizes there, destroys or captures 29 ships, goes to South Africa, goes to the Indian Ocean, to the Java Strait and the Sunda Strait, and then ends up in the Strait of Malacca, which is actually right by Singapore. So this ship has been on a rampage for almost 2 years. At this point, she decides to sail back to France. But let us take an interlude as to how these ships actually operate when they're confronted with an enemy. So, the Alabama's main motto for its ship is, and I think it's very appropriate for a raider, is that God helps those who help themselves. And that's pretty good for a ship that's out on its own for 2 years. Well, on January 11th, 1863, the Alabama is off of Galveston, and the Union blockade fleet decides to investigate this strange ship that's coming in, thinking maybe it's a blockade runner. And so the USS Hatteras sails out, and they get within hailing range. In other words, they can talk back and forth. That's how close they are. And they ask, what ship is this? And the answer comes from the Alabama that they are Her Britannic Majesty's ship Petrel. Well, the Union commander is a little suspicious of this. And he lowers the boat to go and inspect this British ship, supposedly. As soon as that boat hits the water, all of a sudden the Alabama says, nah, 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 we're the Alabama. They lower the British flag, they raise the stars and bars, and begin to shell the Hatteras at point-blank range. The Hatteras is completely undefended and is quickly sunk. So raider tactics are not particularly nice, but that is how they operate generally. So that is the end of the Hatteras. Well, like I said, they have gone from the Malacca Strait off Singapore, and they've sailed to Cherbourg, France. They are in Cherbourg for 3 days. They're hoping to put the ship into dry dock because the ship has been at sea for almost 2 years and needs a considerable amount of work. It is then confronted by the U.S. Kearsarge. The Kearsarge shows up and begins to blockade the Alabama in port, and the Kearsarge, I think it's Kearsarge actually, the Kearsarge is blockading, and Semmes realizes that more Union ships are going to show up, and he is going to be trapped in Cherbourg, and that's going to be the end of his career as a raider. So he makes the decision to take the Kearsarge and say through international channels that he's going to come out and fight. And indeed, that's what they do. The Alabama begins to open fire at extreme range, but her ammunition is old, and it's been at sea for 2 years, and it's not in good condition. The Kearsarge basically decides to close the range and fire its large Dahlgren guns with much more effect. The Alabama actually lands a hit on the stern post of the Kearsarge, but it doesn't explode. Had that shell exploded, and there's actually a picture of this, I'll try to send it out. Had that shell exploded, it probably would have destroyed the steering cable of the Kearsarge, and it would have been a much better chance for the Alabama to achieve a victory. The Kearsarge also, as much as made about that, it was armored. Indeed, what they had done is they had put chains along the side, big, thick, heavy chains, and then had covered them over to hide them with a thin board. Much is made of this, particularly by Semmes, that he would never have fought if he knew it was armored. But the fact of the matter is very few of the Alabama shots actually hit this armor, so it's considered not to have been anything of a major effect. Well, eventually the Alabama is beginning to sink because of the heavy Dahlgren guns are destroying her below waterline, and she surrenders. At this point, a British yacht comes swooping in. Apparently it was a popular thing to go watch these things for like a, like, hey, it's like a contest. And they come in, and Semmes and 14 of his officers are picked up by this British yacht and taken to England. So indeed, he does escape captivity. So, is the Alabama the greatest commerce raider of all time? People will argue with this. She did destroy 65 ships, which is an incredible amount. That is less tonnage than the German Atlantis achieved in World War II. But the fact of the matter is that she was out at sea for 2 years, terrorizing the U.S. Navy, and sank 65 ships. She had an incredible career, and I certainly could make the argument that she was the greatest of all time. Now, that brings us to the final conclusion of the day. Is the American Civil War the first modern naval war? Anybody with a suggestion? Yes, I think it is. And why do I think that? Well, unlike the Army, the land battles, I think this one actually is. And why? I'll tell you why. The fact of the matter is we've got armored ships, we've got rifled guns, we've got turrets, we've got steam power, but most interestingly, what I think puts it over the top is the fact that they used mines and they used the submarine. So the first successful use of mines, the first successful use of submarines, and all these other factors, in my opinion, make the American Civil War the first modern naval war. And next week we will talk about between the wars of the Second Industrial Revolution. Thank you for attending.